Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is going to be the final chapter in Unit 1. So, this is Dahl's On Democracy book continued. And this is going to be Chapter 11 about parties and electoral systems. A lot of this is the meat of what distinguishes democracies from each other. We spent a lot of time on just what is a democracy, but now we're going to get into some of the comparative institutional stuff. Um, and there are a huge variety of ways to run a democratic system. Okay, let's see. We'll just skip straight to section 2, electoral systems. Just know that elections vary wildly. There are a lot of different ways to run elections. You've got the first past the post system, which we'll talk about, or it's also known as single member district or majoritarianism, or it's got a bunch of names. On the other end, you've got proportional representation. And so there are many, many different ways of voting, from just casting a single vote to casting a vote for a party and then tallying them up. And then the party will choose whoever's on their list to put into the parliament or the legislative body. There are systems of rank choice voting, which actually, from what we know from the research, helps to support centrism. And there have been some experiments with that even in the United States. There are mixed systems where maybe one house or a certain percentage of a house will be voted in by PR, and the other allotment will be voted in by single member district. Like, there are a lot of weird ways to go about this. There's a huge literature on the quote equality of elections, both philosophical and mathematical. There have been a number of Nobel Prizes passed out for this kind of stuff, especially just top of mind. I'm thinking of Kenneth Arrow and Arrow's theorem from like the 1950s, and a lot of French scholars from the what is their Société Scientifique or something. It's been around for a couple hundred years, and post France has gone through multiple iterations of governments. They're in like their fifth republic right now. So they've had a bunch of different turnovers of constitutions. And after the French Revolution in 1789, um, there were a lot of scientists trying to figure out the most fair way of voting, right? And I think it was Condorcet. He wrote this brilliant theorem that scientists couldn't even figure out how the hell it worked until just a couple of years ago. They finally sort of cracked the code. But really interesting stuff. I would say a lot of it is way above my head. All of this like deep mathematical probabilities and all kinds of stuff. All right, there's two broad branches of the election tree, kind of like I mentioned above. You've got proportional representation, right? And this basically just means that your party gets approximately the same percentage of legislative seats um, that you won in the election, right? So, say you win 38% of the vote, your party does. You'll take somewhere between 36 and 38% of the vote, depending on how they sort of calculate the legislative seats. A couple things to mention. Usually, there's a minimum. There's what they call an electoral threshold, and it's usually somewhere between like 3 and 5%. And if your party doesn't hit 3 to 5% of the past that electoral threshold, then you don't actually get seated, and your votes get redistributed to the other parties. The reason for this, or the purported reason for this, is to sort of keep out extremist parties, communists and fascists, and but even that's not really working. If you look at Europe, you have sort of Nazi parties rising all over Central Europe, and they are sort of surpassing the minimum threshold. And so now some of the legislative bodies are saying, well, we're just not going to participate with you, even though we have to seat you, right? So But it's also pretty undemocratic philosophically to say, okay, well, only 2% of the population, wants this party in, but like you're rejecting that 2% of the population's vote. And so, in a sense, it's a pretty undemocratic rule to put in. Another important sort of not function, but difference in PR systems is what's called district magnitude. And so in the United States, we have a district magnitude of one, right? One person comes from every legislative district, or every representative district, whatever. And the same is true of England, right? In the UK, they also run these single member district systems. But you can have a geographical area where, say, two all the way up to Israel's 160 are voted from the same district, right? Israel, they just say like, oh, we're running a PR system the entire country wide, right? Most countries sort of break down into legislative districts of some sort, and they will run anywhere from again 2 to say 10 or something like that. And that means that the voters can put in from say 2 to 10 legislators all from the same exact district, right? And this is why the PR system comes into play. And yeah, like I said, I think Israel is the highest district magnitude in the world at 160. Every single one of their legislators from the Knesset comes from just a nationwide election. Uh, PR systems almost always lead to coalition governments because there are more than two parties who are seated. And so generally, no particular party um, has a majority of the legislative seats, 50% plus one, right? Usually, what happens is a handful of parties will all take a significant portion, and it'll range anywhere from, say, like 40% to 15%. And so you'll have to sort of cobble together a coalition of parties that puts you over the majority, right? And then you can govern. That coalition will pick a prime minister and their cabinet, and they will govern as a multi-party government. It's odd for Americans generally to think this way, but that's usually how the PR system works. Usually, there's not an executive like the president. There are a handful of exceptions, especially in places like South America and France. But usually in PR systems, the prime minister is the end all be all, and the voters don't get to actually pick the prime minister. Once the legislative body is settled, then the members will pick the prime minister. So, in that sense, it's also a little bit indirect democracy, at least for the main leader. The president in Germany is, a figurehead, but not in France. In France, the president actually has some power. So there are a lot of variations on this. Let's see. The prime minister and the cabinet make up both the legislative and the executive branch, and arguably, like they don't run the functions of the judicial branch, but they decide what is legal and what is not. In many of these places, there's not like a direct constitution, and there's not judicial review where the courts can overturn something. In some of these places, give me a second. The fucking trash guy is out there. It's driving me crazy. Okay, that's a little better. Okay, in some, I forgot what I was even saying. Um, Judicial review, yeah. There's no judicial review in most of these countries. In some of them, there's like a pre-judicial review system where if you're going to pass a law, the courts will determine whether it is quote unquote constitutional or not. And a really interesting approach instead of the weird American approach where a new law, which may be like on its face completely unconstitutional, has to actually cause. I'm going to lose my mind. Okay, I drove off. Good lord. All right. they have pre-constitutional checks where a court will determine whether something is legal or constitutional or whatever. Um, in America, a law has to actually cause harm to a corporation or a citizen before it can be challenged, which is kind of an odd way to go about it, right? Like, why should a citizen be harmed by a blatantly unconstitutional act? It's very strange, and some are calling for like a pre-constitutional determination in American law as well, but that would take a whole constitutional rejiggering. Okay, let's see. We'll move on to first past the post, right? So we just talked about PR, proportional representation. First past the post is also called majoritarianism or pluralitarianism, and single member district. Like it's got a bunch of different sort of coalition of names, right? Um, and this is, it's only really a plurality system if there's not a runoff. And that's how the United States works, where um, you could potentially only win, say, 40% of the vote, right? If there's multiple candidates in your jurisdiction and still win the election, right? And that means 60% of the elective population doesn't get represented. But in some countries, they'll have what's called a runoff, where, say, there are three or more candidates, they will all run together. If no one gets 50% or more, then they'll take the top two vote getters and have them run against each other so that someone eventually wins a majority. And let's see, the presidency in France is like this, except it has a runoff. All elections in the United States are like this. All elections in England, and I think all elections in India are still like this. This is almost always single member districts. There's generally some of the positives are that there's a clear legislative majority, right? There's none of this sort of jiggery pokery of coalition building and trying to figure out who has accountability for what and all of this. It's like, okay, there's only two parties, right? And someone has a majority, generally in the House or the Senate or whatever. And often there's like a dominant government, right? Like we have right now, where conservatives run the Senate and the House and the executive branch, and arguably the judicial branch. Um, but it sort of allows voters to point and say, okay, like they're either doing well or they're screwing up, right? And so there's a philosophical argument that this sort of system gives greater accountability to the voters. Bum, bum, bum. Now, what I would say about the American system on that point, though, is that federalism makes it a little bit more murky, right? Who's in charge of making sure our roads are great, or our economy is running well, or our food prices are low? Is it the state? Is it our local? Is it the federal government? That makes it a little bit more difficult. Okay, some problems with each system. And we'll talk about single member district first, and then I'll break down PR in the back half. Single member districts can be highly disproportional, right? We talked about like if you don't have a runoff system, you could win 40% of the vote and still have to represent 100% of your district. That's difficult because that means that some people are just not going to get represented, right? You also get third parties locked out, right? What we know, it's called Duverger's law. I think it's from the 1950s. Maurice Duverger, another French sort of electoral mathematician, basically found this correlation that says if you have single member district elections, you will eventually and quickly coalesce around two parties and lock out all the rest. They start to build institutional advantages. They start to build logistics and networking advantages, all of these sorts of things. And unless you have some sort of like ethnic regional party, you will only get a two party system. And so this really locks out a huge ideological representation for most. Um, America's kind of an outlier right now because of our primary system. We're getting more and more sort of extreme on both ends. But usually this means sort of a coalescing around the median voter. There's only two parties. They're all competing for the center voter so they can win an election. And it causes very, historically at least, it's caused less ideological distance between the parties. Okay. Election dates we've talked a little bit about. The problem with this single member district system is that if your government sucks, right, you have a lame duck government, like kind of like we have today, you can't do anything about it. Whereas in a PR system, you can hold a vote of no confidence, sort of reshuffle the government, have new elections, and get a new government in. In our system and other sort of PR locked in electoral date systems, you're stuck with what you got for quite a while, right? And so this can sort of reduce the accountability we were talking about earlier relative to parliamentary or proportional representation systems. There generally tends to be very little cross action party, right? Especially in modern day United States. Whereas, oh shit, PR systems have to use a coalition government. And so it forces them to sort of work across party lines sometimes, even if, and generally they are, sort of at least ideologically similar, right? Like it's very unlikely that the Green Party and the Socialist Party and the fascists are all going to build a coalition government, right? Generally, they stick together with on a left-right scale. Um, but there's a little bit of cross-party action, at least in those leftist coalitions or rightist coalitions. Okay, disproportionate voting you can see below in these tables. If you look at table 2, the hypothetical illustrations of first past the post electoral systems, and then it's got two different examples, right? One where there's a rather mixed population and you get pretty good representation. The other where a clear majority has a majority in every district and you get like pure disproportionality, right? And this is one of the problems with single member district systems is that if you look at that first example, you can think of like an ethnically divided society where you have a clear majority and the clear majority is dispersed across the country, and you have a clear minority and they are also evenly dispersed across the country. Um, then what you get is oppression, basically, right? And you will get very little to no representation for the minority group. And you will get basically tyranny of the majority, whether it be a religious or ethnic or racial or tribal or whatever it might be, sort of majority versus minority system. When it looks like this and it's evenly distributed across the country, it can cause really, really bad problems, right? And it can start to become perpetual. And so, if you look at the South in the US during Jim Crow, it's a really good example of this, where the minorities were basically just washed out. And it looks like it might start getting worse yet again because Article 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was basically gutted. That talked about preventing gerrymandering against racial minorities. It was gutted last year by the Supreme Court. And so we saw a very, very quick implementation of new districts to lock out sort of black voters from what it looks like. At least that's the argument from the left. Um, if you have a racial or ethnic party, but it's not widely distributed or evenly distributed, and you get uh, regional maybe your ethnic group is in a particular region. So if we think about places like India and particular places in Africa, then this can also cause problems in single member district systems where there are questions about sort of regional politics and goods distribution, right? Are all the goods going to, say, the majority urban regions where say, the ethnic majority lives, or are they being evenly distributed between groups? And this is where you can get real problems with like rebellion and secession and violence and civil war and things like this, because they get sort of locked out, right? Except only in the region. And so, yes, maybe they have some representation, but they'll always be a minority, not only ethnic group, but minority legislative party, right? And that sort of locking out over time can cause some real frustrations. Okay, let's move on to potential problems with proportional representation. Proportional representation can also be highly disproportionate, but a lot of this swings on that district magnitude that we talked about earlier, and also the electoral threshold. If you have a whole bunch of parties, say you have like 20 parties running, and this happens in places like Greece and Italy and elsewhere, and a shitload of them get votes, but not above the threshold. That means all of those voters basically get ignored and their votes get distributed to other parties, right? And so this can be kind of problematic sometimes too. The problem is that greater district magnitudes, where you have a whole bunch of parties from one region, can cause problems as well, right? It can cause fractionalization and it can cause the sort of proliferation of parties, which can be troubling, right? Where everyone has their own idea about how politics should be run, and there's 20 or 30 different ideological parties out there, all vying for votes. Building coalitions under that sort of circumstances can be a nightmare, which is why you see places like Greece and Italy sort of roll through governments all the time. You get big swings in party support at times, right? The coalition that is in charge, did a terrible job, and so you'll see a mass exodus of voters into new parties, and you can get these wild swings in electoral outcomes, which makes things very unpredictable for the government, right? And it makes it very unpredictable on how we can put in policy that's not just going to get scrapped every time we turn around. We talked about the problems of accountability. It's really hard to hold someone accountable if you don't know who to hold accountable. Say there's four different parties in your coalitional government, and there's three others in the opposition, right? Which of those four parties do you hold accountable? Which of their leaders do you hold accountable? It becomes really problematic to sort of hold a particular party to account. You get wild swings in electoral periods. I mean, there for a while, Italy was scrapping their government and having to build a new one like every 5 months or something. It was absolutely crazy. Right now, they've got a little more stability under Giorgia Meloni. Um, but some of these PR systems, because of the vote of no confidence system, can cause a lot of instability over time as you get a constant scrapping of governments. Excuse me, I'm sick of the bugs. They're driving me nuts. Okay, another problem with the PR system is, like we talked about, there's very little judicial review. And in fact, there's very little separation of powers at all. The prime minister and their cabinet are the end all be all. They are the executive branch, they are the legislative branch, and in many ways, they decide what is legal and what is not. And the courts are only there to determine, if you broke the law that exists, and what penalty should you pay for it, but they're not there to determine whether this law is even legal, because the government wrote it. That makes it legal, right? Um, and so some of these states don't really have like a direct constitution that they go back to and check on. It's just like, well, you're the majority party, then the law is what you say it is. And that feels a little weird as an American. Let's see. Ba, 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 ba. Oh, yeah. And just the fact that, again, you don't choose your prime minister. You don't actually choose the leader of your country, which is disconcerting from a democratic perspective, right? You indirectly choose your prime minister by choosing your representative, who then gets placed in the legislative chamber. And once a coalition government is created, then that coalition government chooses their own prime minister. So you, as a voter, have no choice really in who the prime minister is going to be. Now, parties will say, beforehand, like if this is how it shakes up, this is who we plan to make our prime minister, so that there's a little bit of a connection there. Um, but this is a difficult piece of the proportional representation system. Okay, you know what? I'm going to stop it there, and I will do a back half of this lecture because this one's getting pretty big. All right, thanks for being here. Have a great day. Sorry about the dump truck. Jeez.